On September 19, 1991, the German hikers were crossing a high, icy pass in Ötzi tall Alps when they saw something emerging from the melting ice. At first, they thought it was the body of a modern climber. That assumption was wrong. The man in the ice had not been dead for decades. He had been lying there for more than 5,300 years. Today we know him as Ötzi the Iceman. He was not buried by his people. He was not preserved by ritual embalming. He was naturally mummified by cold, wind ice dehydration, and time. His body, his clothing, his weapons, his tools, his last meal, and even his wounds survived long enough to become one of the most extraordinary forensic cases in human history. In modern terms, Ötzi is not simply an archaeological discovery. He is a cold case, a murder case, a crime scene frozen in the Alps since the Copper Age. Before we examine the evidence, we need to understand the world he came from. Ötzi lived around 3300 BC, during the transition from the late Neolithic period into the Copper Age in Europe. This was not a world of isolated cave people. Communities in and around the Alps were already farming, raising animals, hunting wild game, making tools, and participating in exchange networks that connected valleys, mountains, and distant regions. People grew cereals, they kept sheep, goats, and cattle, they hunted red deer and ibex, and most importantly, they had begun to use copper. Copper was not an ordinary material. To produce or acquire copper tools, a society needed access to war metallurgy, craft knowledge, and trade routes. A copper axe was not just a tool, it was a sign of technology, wealth, and status. Ötzi carried such an axe. Its blade was made of high-purity copper, and later research suggests that the copper may have originated far to the south, in what is now Tuscany. That means Ötzi's world was not isolated. It was part of a wider system of movement, exchange, and social connection. But such a world also carried danger. Where there are roots, there can be rivalry. Where there is trade, there can be conflict. Where there is status, there can be envy. Hunting grounds, water sources, mountain passes, metal marriage alliances, family honor, and local power could all become sources of violence. And according to the forensic evidence, Ötzi did not simply die in the mountains by accident. The most stable conclusion is that he was killed. The central evidence includes an arrow wound in the back of his left shoulder, a flint arrowhead still lodged inside his body, CT evidence of damage near major blood vessels in the shoulder region, and traces of red blood cells and clotting related material around the wound. Now let us treat this as a forensic investigation. Ötzi was an adult male. He was probably around 40 to 50 years old when he died, with a commonly cited estimate of about 46. He stood roughly 160 meters tall and weighed around 50 kilograms. By modern standards, he was not large, but he was lean, tough, and clearly used to physical hardship. His body tells us that he was not a lost amateur who wandered into the high mountains by mistake. His hips, shoulders, knees, and spine all showed signs of wear. This was a man who walked long distances, climbed steep terrain, carried loads, and lived an active mountain life. His lungs contained traces consistent with long-term exposure to smoke, probably from indoor hearths. His teeth were badly worn. He had cavities, gum disease, and signs of oral trauma, suggesting a raw diet that included abrasive grains and particles. His body also carried evidence of parasite and pathogens. Researchers found whipworm eggs in his digestive tract. Fleas were associated with his clothing. His stomach carried Helicobacter pylori, a bacterium still common today. Ancient DNA studies also identified evidence associated with Borrelia, linked to Lyme disease. In short, Ötzi was not a mythic mountain warrior in perfect health. He had joint pain, bad teeth, parasite infections, and old injuries, but none of these killed him. What killed him was an arrow. In 2001, X-rays revealed a flint arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder area. Later CT scans and forensic analysis showed that the arrow had entered from behind, striking the back of his left shoulder. The entry wound was about 2 centimeters wide. The arrow damaged a major blood vessel near the shoulder, probably close to the subclavian artery region. That kind of injury is extremely dangerous. A wound to a major vessel can cause rapid internal bleeding, even if the victim does not die instantly. The body can quickly lose enough blood to cause shock, collapse and death. This means C was almost certainly shot from behind, and the wound was not post-mortem damage. Researchers found preserved red blood cells in the wound area. Evidence of clotting-related material has also been discussed that matters, because clotting is a biological response to injury. It indicates that the wound happened while he was alive, or very close to the moment of death. So the first major conclusion is clear. C was murdered. The next question is harder. Was this a robbery, a random attack, a revenge killing, a political killing, a fight that had begun days earlier? To answer that, we need to examine another wound. C had a deep cut on his right hand, between the thumb and index finger. This wound is extremely important. It was not just a scratch, it was a serious injury, and forensic interpretation suggests it occurred several days before his death, perhaps around 3 to 8 days earlier. That location is suspicious. In modern forensic medicine, cuts on the palm fingers or the web of the hand often appear when someone tries to block a blade, grab a weapon, or defend themselves in close combat. In other words, Ötzi may have been in a fight several days before he died. This turns the case into something more complex. He was not simply walking through the mountains when a stranger suddenly killed him. The evidence suggests there was a previous violent incident. He survived the first encounter, continued moving, and was later shot in the mountains. There is also a famous claim that blood from multiple other individuals was found on his weapons and clothing, suggesting he may have fought several people, wounded others, or even carried an injured companion. It is an intriguing possibility. It makes for a dramatic reconstruction. But strictly speaking, that evidence is weaker than the arrow wound, the CT scans, the hand injury, and the stomach content analysis, the strongest. Forensic evidence supports our previous case. Range conflict and alter fatal arrow wound. Claims about multiple attackers or multiple blood traces should be treated cautiously. So what can we say with confidence? We can say this. Ötzi had a serious hand wound before his death. He was later shot in the back, or rear side of the shoulder. He was not killed by disease, and this was very unlikely to be a simple mountain accident. Now let us examine what he carried. Ötzi was not found empty-handed. He had a complete mountain survival kit. The most important object was his copper axe. The blade was made of extremely pure copper. It was attached to a wood handle using birch tar and leather bindings. The axe could be used for woodworking, cutting, and even combat, but its deeper meaning was social. In the Copper Age, the copper axe was valuable. It represented access to technology and exchange networks. It may also have marked the owner as someone of importance. But here is the crucial point. The killer did not take the axe. If this had been a robbery, why leave behind the most valuable object at the scene? That single fact strongly weighs against the robbery theory. The killer target was probably not Ötzi's property. The target was Ötzi himself. He also carried a long bow made of wood. It was about 1.8 meters long, but it was unfinished. It had not been fully polished or strung. That is very important. It tells us he had a weapon in preparation. But at the time of death, he was not fully combat ready. His quiver contained 12 arrow shafts, but only 2 arrows were complete. Most were unfinished. This is another strange detail. A hunter or warrior setting out fully prepared would normally want more usable arrows, so his equipment suggests pressure. He was prepared enough to travel, but not fully supplied. He also carried a flint dagger with an ash wood handle. The blade was small and heavily resharpened, suggesting it was close to the end of its usable life. He had a retouching tool for repairing flint implements. He carried birch bark containers, one of which contained charcoal and leaves, probably for carrying embers or fire-making material. He also had pieces of birch polyp or fungus, which may have had medicinal or practical uses, possibly as an antimicrobial, digestive aid or fire-related material. This was not a helpless man. He knew how to survive in the mountains, but his weapons and tools were not in ideal condition. His bow was unfinished. His arrows were mostly unfinished. His dagger was worn down. That combination suggests a man who had a plan, route or purpose, but who may have been forced to move before he was fully ready. Now let us look at his clothing. Jitsi wore a carefully assembled mountain outfit. He had a coat made of sheep and goat hide. He wore leggings, a loincloth shoes, and a bearskin cap. His shoes were especially sophisticated. They were not just pieces of leather wrapped around the feet, they included plant fiber netting, dry grass insulation, and an ultra leather structure. They were designed for walking, cold weather, and mountain terrain. His clothes were repaired in several places. That tells us they were practical, long-used garments, not ceremonial clothing. He was dressed for travel. He was dressed for the mountains. He was dressed like someone who knew exactly where he was going. Then we come to one of the most revealing clues in the entire case. His last meal. He did not die on an empty stomach. Analysis of his stomach contents shows that shortly before death, he ate a high-fat, high-calorie meal. It included ibex meat and fat, red deer meat, and wheat, and traces of furin. The fat content was remarkably high. This matters greatly. First, we against the idea that he was in a long, desperate starving flight. Second, it shows that near the end of his life, he still had access to food and enough calm or opportunity to eat. Third, the food was ideal for high-altitude movement in a cold mountain environment. Fat is a powerful source of sustained energy. So Tse was not simply running blindly in panic. He was moving with purpose. He was under pressure, perhaps, but he still had planning capacity. Isotopic and botanical evidence also suggests that during the final phase of his life, he crossed multiple ecological zones. Pollen evidence indicates that within roughly the last 33 hours, he moved through different altitude bands, from lower or warmer vegetation zones, back up toward the high alpine ice zone. This was not aimless wandering. It was a directed movement through the mountains. Was it a normal journey, or an escape? The most cautious answer is probably both, but with more weight on escape or pressure. He was not completely unprepared, because he carried 3 tools, clothing, and his axe. But he was not fully ready, either, because his weapons were incomplete and his right hand had been badly wounded days earlier. The most likely reconstruction is this. Several days before his death, Jitsi was involved in a close-range violent confrontation. His right hand was cut deeply, perhaps while defending himself against a blade or trying to seize a weapon. He survived, but from that moment, he may have known he was in danger. Over the next days, he continued moving. He carried his copper axe, dagger, fire kit, food, unfinished bow, and limited usable arrows. His equipment was functional, but strained. His tools were worn. His bow was not ready. His arrows were not enough. He moved through changing altitudes, likely along a route he knew. He may have been trying to cross a pass. He may have been going to meet someone. He may have been leaving hostile territory. He may have been seeking safety. At some point shortly before death, he stopped and ate ibex fat, wild meat, deer, and grain. It was a rational mountain meal, dense in energy and suitable for cold travel. This moment is important. A man who stops to eat may believe he has time. He may believe he has created distance from danger. He may not know that someone is still behind him. Then the arrow came. The shooter was likely behind him or behind and to the side. The arrow entered the back of his left shoulder and drove deep into the body. It damaged a major vessel. Jitsi would have felt sudden pain, weakness, and blood loss. The arrow shaft was later removed, but the arrow had remained lodged inside him. There are 2 main possibilities. 1. Jitsi tried to pull the arrow at himself, but only removed or broke the shaft. 2. The attacker approached him and removed the shaft, perhaps to recover it or to hide obvious evidence. We cannot prove which is correct, but both possibilities imply that after the arrow hit, there may have been a short interval of action, either by the victim or by the killer. After that, he may have fallen and struck his head. Evidence for head trauma exists, but it is less certain than the arrow wound. Some studies support brain injury or bleeding. Other recent interpretations are more cautious. So the most rigorous statement is this: the arrow wound was the decisive fatal injury. Head trauma may have contributed, but it was probably not the primary cause of death. Finally, she died in a high-altitude hollow. His killer did not take the copper axe. His gear was not systematically looted. The body was left in place. Then the mountain did the rest. Snow, ice, cold air, and dehydration preserved the body, the equipment, and the evidence. For more than 5,000 years, the crime scene remained sealed. What kind of man was Ötzi? He was not necessarily a chief or king, but he was probably not an insignificant wanderer either. He owned a copper axe. He carried specialized mountain equipment. His materials came from different animals and different regions. He had tools for repair, fire cutting, hunting, and survival. He was experienced enough to move across high alpine terrain. This suggests a man with skill, mobility, and access to resources. That kind of person could easily become involved in disputes over status, trade routes, kinship alliances, or revenge. His tattoos add another layer to his portrait. Ötzi had 61 tattoo marks. They were mostly lines and crosses, placed around the lower back, knees, ankles, wrists, and other areas. Many of these locations correspond to parts of the body that should wear or would likely have been painful. That suggests the tattoos may not have been decorative. They may have been therapeutic, perhaps an early form of pain treatment. This makes him more human. He was not a superhero of prehistory. He was a middle-aged mountain man with bad teeth, parasite, joint pain, old injuries, and possibly chronic illness. Yet he was still strong enough to climb the Alps, still experienced enough to carry a survival kit, still alert enough to travel with fire, food, weapons, and tools, still alive long enough for his body to preserve the story of his death. Ötzi the Iceman was not simply a man who froze to death in the Alps. His wounds, his last meal, and the copper axe left beside him all point to something far darker. A Aztec killing whose truth survived in the ice for 5,300 years.